of the prologue from the Canterbury Tales. This starts on page 18 of your textbook. You may follow along in this recording or you may follow along in your textbook. From the prologue, Geoffrey Chaucer, translated by Neville Coghill. Geoffrey Chaucer chose to write his poetry not in French, the official language of the English court, nor in Latin, the official language of the church, but in the vernacular, the everyday language of his time and place. That vernacular was a form of English that scholars now call Middle English. Chaucer's masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, is a collection of stories in verse. Chaucer uses the device of a frame story, a story that includes other stories. The frame describes a pilgrimage, a religious journey in which a group is on its way to Canterbury Cathedral. The Canterbury Tales opens with a general prologue that introduces the pilgrims, a diverse group including a knight, a miller, a prioress, a carpenter, a merchant, and Chaucer himself. The group decides to exchange stories as a way of passing time during their journey. Many of the stories are vivid retellings of old tales. What is most remarkable, however, is Chaucer's achievement in portraying each storyteller as a distinct individual, each with his or her own particular motivations, traits, or foibles. Presenting figures from a range of medieval society, including the church, the court, and the emerging middle class, Chaucer's remarkably diverse and individualized characterizations constitute what one scholar has called a concise portrait of an entire nation, high and low, old and young, male and female, lay and clerical, learned and ignorant, rogue and righteous. When in April the sweet showers fall, and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower. When also Zephyrus, with his sweet breath, exhales an air in every grove and heath. Upon the tender shoots, and the young sun, his half-course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl are making melody, that sleep away the night with open eye. So nature pricks them, and their heart engages, then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints, hallowed in sundry lands. And specially from every shire's end of England down to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr quick, to give his help to them when they were sick. It happened in that season that one day in Southwark, at the Tabard, as I lay, ready to go on pilgrimage and start for Canterbury, most devout at heart, at night there came into hostelry some 9 and 20 in a company of sundry folk happening then to fall in fellowship, and they were pilgrims all, that towards Canterbury meant to ride. The rooms and stables of the inn were wide. They made us easy, all was of the best. And briefly, when the sun had gone to rest, I'd spoken to them all upon the trip. And soon and was soon one with them in fellowship, pledged to rise early and to take the way to Canterbury, as you heard me say. But none the less, while I have time and space, before my story takes a further pace, it seems a reasonable thing to say what their condition was, the full array of each of them, as it appeared to me, according to profession and degree, and what apparel they were riding in, and at a night I therefore will begin. There was a knight, a most distinguished man, who from the day on which he first began to ride abroad had followed chivalry, truth, honor, generousness, and courtesy. He had done nobly in his sovereign's war, and ridden into battle no man more, as well in Christian as in heathen places, and ever honored for his noble graces. When we took Alexandria he was there. He often sat at table in the chair of honor above all nations. When in Prussia and Lithuania he had ridden, and Russia, no Christian man was so often of his rank. When in Granada, Algeciras, Algeciras, Algeciras sang, under assault he had been there, and in North Africa, raiding Benameron. In Anatolia he had been as well, and fought when Aias and Italia fell, for all along the Mediterranean coast he had embarked with many a noble host. In 15 mortal battles he had been, and jousted for our faith in Trasimene. Thrice in the lists, and always killed his man, the same distinguished knight had led the van, once with the Bey of Balat doing work, for him against another heathen Turk. He was of sovereign value in all eyes, and though so much distinguished he was wise, and in his bearing modest as a maid, he never yet a boorish thing has said, and all his life to any come what might, he was a true and perfect gentle knight. Speaking of his equipment, he possessed fine horses, but he was not gaily dressed. He wore a fustian tunic stained and dark with smudges where his armor had left mark. Just home from service he had joined our ranks to do his pilgrimages and render thanks. He had his son with him, a fine young squire, a lover and cadet, a lad of fire, with locks as curly as if they had been pressed. He was some 20 years of age, I guessed. In stature he was of a moderate length, with wonderful agility and strength. He'd seen some service with some cavalry in Flanders and Artois and Picardy, and had done valiantly in little space, of time and hope to win his lady's grace. He was embroidered like a meadow bright, and full of freshest flowers, red and white. Singing he was, or fluting all the day, he was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, the sleeves were long and wide. He knew the way to sit a horse and ride. He could make songs and poems and recite, knew how to joust and dance, to draw and write. He loved so hotly till dawn grew pale, he slept as little as a nightingale. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved to serve his father at the table. There was a yeoman with him as at his side, no other servant, so he chose to ride. This yeoman wore a coat and hood of green, and peacock feathered arrows, bright and keen, and neatly sheathed, hung at his belt the while, for he could dress his gear in yeoman style. His arrow never drooped their feathers low, and in his hand he bore a mighty bow. His hand was like a nut, his face was brown, he knew the whole of woodcraft up and down. A saucy brace was on his arm to ward it from the bowstring, and a shield and sword hung at one side, and at the other slipped a jaunty dirk, spear sharp and well equipped. A medal of St. Christopher he wore, of shining silver on his breast, and bore a hunting horn, well slung and burnished clean, that dangled from a baldric of bright green. He was a proper forester, I guess. There was a nun, a prioress, her way of smiling very simple and coy. Her greatest oath was by St. Loy, and she was known as Madame Eglantine, and well she sang a service with a fine intoning through her nose, as was most seemly, and she spoke faintly in French, extremely. After the school of Stratford at Bow, French in the peristyle she did not know. At meat her manners were well taught withal. No morsel from her lips did she let fall, nor dip her fingers in sauce too deep, but she could carry a morsel up and keep the smallest drop from falling on her breast. For courtliness she had a special zest, and she would wipe her upper lip so clean that not a trace of grace was to be seen upon the cup when she had drunk to eat. She reached a hand sedately for the meat. She certainly was very entertaining, pleasant and friendly in her ways, and straining to counterfeit a courtly kind of grace, a stately bearing fitting to her place, and to seem dignified in all her dealings. As for her sympathies and tender feelings, she was so charitably solicitous. She used to weep if sorry if she saw a mouse caught in a trap if it were dead or bleeding. And she had little dogs she would be feeding with roasted flesh or milk or fine white bread. And bitterly she wept if one were dead, or some one took a stick and made it smart. She was all sentiment, a tender heart. Her veil was gathered in a seemly way, her nose was elegant, her eyes glass gray. Her mouth was very small, but soft and red, her forehead certainly was fair of spread, almost a span across the brows, I own. She was indeed by no means undergrown. Her cloak, I noticed, had a graceful charm. She wore a coral trinket on her arm, a set of beads, the gaudiest trick in green, whence hung a golden brooch of brightest sheen, on which there first was graven a crowned A, and lower a more Vincent Omnia. Another nun, the secretary at her cell, was writing with her, and 3 priests as well. A monk there was, one of the finest sort, who rode the country, hunting was his sport. A manly man, to be in a able, many a dainty horse he had in stable. His bridle, when he rode, a man might hear, jingling in a whistling wind as clear, ay, and as loud as does the chapel bell, where my lord monk was prior of the cell. The rule of good Saint Bennet or Saint Maur, as old and strict, he tended to ignore. He let go by the things of yesterday and took the modern world's more spacious way. He did not rate that text at a plucked hen which says that hunters are not holy men, and that a monk uncloistered is a mere fish out of water, flapping on the pier. That is to say, a monk out of his cloister, that was a text he held not worth an oyster. And I agreed, and said his views were sound. Was he to study till his head went round, poring over books and cloisters? He must toil, as Austin bade, until the very soil. Was he to leave the world upon the shelf? Let Austin have his labor himself. This monk was therefore a good man to horse. Greyhounds he had, swift as birds, to course. Hunting and a hare or riding at a fence was all his fun, he spared for no expense. I saw his sleeves were garnished at the hand with fine grey fur, the finest in the land, and on his hood, to fasten it at his chin, he had a wrought gold cunningly fashioned pin. And to a lover's knot it seemed to pass, his head was bald, and shone like looking glass. So did his face, as if it had been greased. He was a fat and personable priest. His prominent eyeballs never seemed to settle. Okay, we will continue the next portion of this reading on the next video. Thank you.